Have you ever noticed that it's never the weakest person in the room who ends up entangled with a narcissist? It's the strong one, the capable one, the one who shows up early, fixes what's broken, listens when no one else will, and carries more than their share without ever asking for credit. It's the person everyone secretly relies on, the one whose strength looks from the outside like immunity. And yet somehow, it's precisely this person who ends up trapped for years in a relationship, a friendship, a job, with someone who slowly drains them of everything they have. If you've lived this, you already know the confusion that comes with it. You keep asking yourself the same question, late at night, staring at a ceiling that offers no answers. Why me? You were the strong one. You were the one with boundaries, with insight, with the emotional intelligence to see manipulation coming from a mile away in other people's lives. So how did you, of all people, end up here? Smaller, quieter, more exhausted than you've ever been, wondering when you stopped recognizing yourself in the mirror. The answer Carl Jung arrived at nearly a century ago is more unsettling than most people are prepared for. Because the truth is not that the strong are targeted despite their strength. They are targeted because of it. And once you understand why, you will never see another manipulator, or yourself, the same way again. Most people walk through life with a comforting assumption that predators choose prey the way nature intends, the weak culled from the herd, the wounded picked off first. It's a clean story. It's also wrong. Jung spent decades inside the consulting room, listening to the inner lives of people who had been devastated by relationships with deeply narcissistic individuals, husbands, mothers, business partners, mentors, and he noticed something that contradicted the popular myth entirely. The people sitting across from him were not, as a rule, fragile. They were unusually gifted, unusually responsible, unusually full of exactly the kind of inner resources a narcissist does not have and cannot generate on their own. Because here is the mechanism, stripped of all sentimentality. A narcissist does not have a stable internal sense of self. Underneath the performance of confidence is a void, not metaphorically but structurally. Jung would have described it as a profound disconnection from what he called the self, the unifying center of the psyche that gives a person a felt sense of wholeness even when life is difficult. Most people, however imperfect, have some thread connecting them to that center. The narcissist's thread was severed early, usually in childhood, usually through some catastrophic failure of mirroring, a parent who could not see the child as a separate person with their own inner world, only as an extension of their own needs. And so the child built, instead of a self, a performance, a mask. Jung had a name for this too, the persona, swollen until it consumed almost everything behind it. Therefore, and this is the hinge on which the entire dynamic turns, a person with no internal source of vitality must find an external one. They cannot generate their own sense of worth, their own emotional regulation, their own felt experience of being enough. So they go looking for someone who can supply it, and weakness cannot supply anything. An empty person cannot be filled by another empty person. What the narcissist is unconsciously hunting for is light, warmth, capability, emotional depth, a nervous system steady enough to absorb their chaos without collapsing. In other words, they are hunting for exactly the qualities you have spent your whole life building. This is the paradox most people never see coming. The very strength that makes you safe in every other area of your life is the strength that makes you a target in this one. Picture a woman named Sarah, 34 years old, a senior project manager at a mid-sized firm, the kind of person colleagues quietly described as the glue. She had spent years cultivating exactly the traits self-help books tell you to cultivate: emotional regulation, patience, the ability to stay calm under pressure, a generous and forgiving nature that didn't collapse into people-pleasing. because she also had boundaries, mostly in every other part of her life. She'd had 2 prior relationships end amicably because the men simply weren't a good intellectual or emotional match. She was, by any reasonable measure, psychologically robust. Then she met Daniel. Not the cinematic villain of pop culture, no cruelty in the first 6 months, no red flags waving in the wind. Quite the opposite. Daniel was magnetic, complimentary, almost embarrassingly attentive. He told her within weeks that he had never met anyone like her, that she understood him in a way no one else ever had, that she made him want to be better. What Sarah didn't know, what almost no one in her position ever knows in the moment, is that this idealization phase is not romance, it is reconnaissance. The narcissist is, at a level beneath conscious awareness, conducting an inventory. How much capacity does this person have? How much can I draw from this well before it notices it's being drained? Because here is the second mechanism, and it is the one that explains everything that comes after. A narcissist does not experience your strength the way you do. You experience your own resilience as simply who you are, your steadiness, your insight, your emotional generosity, woven so deeply into your character that you rarely even notice it as a resource. But the narcissist experiences it as supply, something to be extracted, and like any extraction process, it works best on a target who can withstand the extraction the longest without breaking down, walking away, or fighting back too soon. Weak people set off alarms quickly. They collapse, they flee, they expose the manipulation before it can be fully exploited. Strong people absorb. They rationalize the early warning signs. They give second chances, third chances, fifth chances, because their capacity for understanding is, ironically, the very thing being weaponized against them. This is the cruelest irony Jung's framework reveals. Your empathy is not what's wrong with you, it's what they're stealing. There's a concept Jung developed that explains the mechanism even more precisely, and it has almost nothing to do with the narcissist's victim and almost everything to do with the narcissist's own psyche. Jung proposed that everyone carries a shadow, the parts of ourselves we've repressed because they were unacceptable to our family, our culture, our early sense of survival. Most people assume the shadow is only made of dark material, rage, cruelty, selfishness, lust. But Jung insisted on something far less intuitive. He called it the golden shadow, the repressed material that is not dark at all, but luminous. Talents disowned, power disowned, brilliance disowned. Because in some families, in some early environments, it was not safe to shine. A child who outperformed an insecure parent, who showed too much emotional intelligence, who had a gift the family system couldn't tolerate, learned to hide that gift the same way another child learns to hide their anger. The narcissist, in this framework, is a person who has hidden away their golden shadow so completely that they no longer have any conscious access to their own potential for genuine strength, depth, or worth. They cannot retrieve it from inside themselves, so instead, they do something far more dangerous. They go looking for it in other people, and once they find it, they orbit that person obsessively, feeding off a light they are convinced they cannot generate on their own. Because they cannot own their own gold, therefore, they must steal someone else's. This is why narcissists so often choose partners, employees, or friends who are, by every external measure, more impressive than they are. The pattern confuses outside observers constantly. Why would someone so insecure choose someone so accomplished? But it confuses no one who understands projection. The narcissist isn't choosing despite the accomplishment. They're choosing because of it. They have unconsciously identified a person carrying the very gold they buried in themselves decades ago, and they will spend years trying to access it. First through admiration, then through possession, then, when admiration and possession fail to actually fill the void, because nothing external ever can, through devaluation. Because if they cannot have your light, The only remaining option to a psyche this fragmented is to extinguish it, diminish you until you are no longer a painful reminder of what they themselves lack. History offers its own specimen of this dynamic, and Jung had a front-row seat to it in his own life. His early relationship with Sigmund Freud began in something close to worship. Freud was the towering father figure of a new science, and Jung, young and brilliant, was anointed as his heir. For years, the admiration flowed almost entirely in one direction. But as Jung began to develop ideas of his own, ideas that didn't simply extend Freud's theories but diverged from them, carrying their own gold, the relationship soured into one of the most bitter intellectual ruptures of the 20th century. Jung later came to understand, through painful personal experience, that idealization, which depends on the idealized person remaining smaller than the idealizer, is not admiration at all. It's a contract that can only be honored by one party staying diminished. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing decades before Jung gave this pattern a clinical name, had already diagnosed its emotional engine with brutal precision. He called it ressentiment, the slow-burning resentment the weak feel toward the strong, a resentment so unbearable to consciously acknowledge that it disguises itself as virtue, as moral superiority, as love. Nietzsche observed that those who cannot achieve greatness through their own strength will often try to achieve it by tearing down anyone who reminds them of what they lack. He wasn't writing a clinical paper on narcissism. He didn't need to. He had simply watched the same human pattern Jung would later watch from behind a different desk. Weakness, confronted with strength it cannot match, frequently chooses to destroy rather than admire, because admiration without the possibility of equality is unbearable. Therefore, it curdles into the need to dominate. If you're watching this and a particular face has already surfaced in your mind, a partner, a parent, a boss, type the word light in the comments, not as a confession, just as a marker. You'd be surprised how many other people scrolling through these comments are about to type the exact same word, having lived a version of the exact same story in a different city, with a different name attached to the same psychological blueprint. There is an old current running through Eastern philosophy that arrives at the same warning from a completely different direction. In the Taoist tradition, there's a long-standing caution against displaying one's full brilliance too openly, not because brilliance is shameful, but because an undefended light draws exactly the kind of attention that seeks to consume it. The image used historically is almost identical to a moth and a flame, except inverted. It is not the flame that is endangered by attraction, but the bearer of the flame, who can be exhausted by every creature drawn to its warmth without the wisdom to protect what's burning. This isn't a call to dim yourself. It's a call to understand that visibility without discernment is a vulnerability, no matter how much inner gold you're carrying. David learned this the hard way, in a different theater entirely. Not romance, but work. He was the kind of employee every manager dreams of having, and every insecure manager secretly fears having. Brilliant at his job, unfailingly composed in meetings, the one who solved the problem no one else could solve, then handed the credit to the team without a second thought, because recognition had simply never been his currency. His manager, a man whose authority rested almost entirely on title rather than competence, began slowly to lean on David for everything, every difficult client call, every crisis, every piece of strategic thinking the manager himself couldn't produce. For 2 years, David told himself this was simply what a good employee did. He didn't notice that he had quietly become the engine keeping his manager's reputation intact. What David didn't see, what almost no one in his position sees until it's too late, is that competence offered freely to an insecure authority figure does not generate gratitude, it generates threat. Because every time David solved a problem, he was, without intending to, making visible the exact gap his manager spent every day trying to hide. And so the dynamic flipped, the way it always eventually does. Subtle undermining in meetings, credit quietly redirected upward, a performance review that made no logical sense given 2 years of measurable results. David wasn't punished for failing. He was punished for succeeding too visibly, in front of someone whose entire sense of self depended on nobody noticing the difference between them, because his light made the absence of light next to him impossible to ignore. Therefore, the light itself became the target. This is where Jung's clinical observations sharpen into something genuinely useful, because the question stops being, "Why does this happen to me?" and becomes, "What do I do now that I understand the mechanism?" And the honest answer is not what most people expect. It is not become less. It is not shrink your gifts so you stop attracting this. That solution treats the gold as the problem, when the gold was never the problem. The problem was that the gold was unconscious, given away freely, defended by no boundary, recognized by everyone except the person who actually owned it. Jung's process of individuation rests on a deceptively simple premise. You cannot protect what you do not consciously possess. If your strength operates as an unconscious habit rather than a known asset, if you are generous because you've never considered the alternative, patient because you've never measured the cost, perceptive because you've never asked who benefits from your perception, then that strength is, in a very real sense, unowned. It floats outside your control, available to anyone perceptive enough to locate it and patient enough to drain it slowly. The strongest people are targeted longest, not because they're foolish, but because their strength was never something they chose to deploy. It was simply something they were. And what you simply are, without ever examining it, can be used against you by someone far more deliberate about studying you than you ever were about studying yourself. The Stoics arrived at a parallel insight, though they applied it to suffering rather than manipulation specifically. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately to himself in what would become the Meditations, returned again and again to a single discipline. The obstacle does not defeat you. Your relationship to the obstacle does. He didn't mean this as comfort. He meant it as instruction. The narcissist in your life, the parent, the partner, the manager, is, in Stoic terms, an external event entirely outside your control. What remains inside your control is whether you continue to offer your light unconsciously, as habit, or whether you begin offering it consciously as choice, with discernment about who has earned access to it. Because, and this is the second hinge the whole transformation depends on, the moment you become conscious of your golden shadow, you stop being an easy target. Not because you've become harder, colder, or less generous, but because consciousness changes the terms of the exchange entirely. An unconscious gift can be taken without permission. A conscious gift requires permission to even be offered. The narcissist's entire model depends on supply flowing without resistance, without scrutiny, without the supplier ever fully realizing what's being extracted. The moment you see the mechanism clearly, that flow requires your active participation. And participation, once it's a choice rather than a habit, can be withdrawn. This is exactly the moment that produces the reaction almost everyone in this situation eventually witnesses, and almost no one is prepared for. Rage, not sadness, not introspection. Rage, often disproportionate to whatever boundary was actually set. Because when supply that has flowed unconsciously for months or years suddenly requires consent, the narcissist doesn't experience this as a reasonable adult setting a reasonable limit. They experience it as annihilation. You are no longer simply a source of light to them. You are now a source of light that has started asking questions, and a light that asks questions is a light that might eventually stop shining for them entirely. Daniel, not Sarah's Daniel, a different man in a different city who reached out to a therapist after 18 months of slowly losing himself inside a friendship he couldn't quite name as harmful, described this exact moment in a single sentence that has stayed with everyone who's ever heard a version of it. The day I stopped explaining myself to him was the day he started telling everyone I had changed. He hadn't changed. He had simply stopped offering, unconsciously, the very thing that had kept the relationship alive for both of them. And what looked from the outside like him becoming colder was in fact the first time in years he had become fully present to his own boundaries, present enough to notice where his energy was going, and deliberate enough to redirect it. Because withdrawal of unconscious supply is experienced by the supply-dependent psyche as betrayal. Therefore, the strongest person in the relationship is so often, eventually, recast as the villain in the story, not because they did anything wrong, but because the moment they became conscious was the moment the extraction stopped working. If any part of this is landing somewhere uncomfortably specific right now, if you're recognizing the shape of a particular relationship in your own life, past or current, it might be worth sitting with this question for a moment before you keep watching. What part of your strength have you never actually claimed as your own, not performed, not exercised on autopilot, actually claimed the way you'd claim a piece of property, with full knowledge of its value and full authority over who gets access to it? Jung believed that the integration of the golden shadow was, paradoxically, one of the hardest pieces of psychological work a person could undertake. Harder, in many cases, than facing the darker material most people associate with shadow work. Because claiming your own greatness requires confronting a deep, often ancient fear, the fear that if you take up the space your strength actually occupies, you will lose love. Most people who give their light away unconsciously learn to do so very early in families or environments where shining too brightly threatened someone else's fragile sense of self. A parent who couldn't tolerate being outshone, a sibling whose insecurity required you to stay smaller, a culture that taught humility as the suppression of gifts rather than the honest stewardship of them. This is the deepest root of why the strong keep attracting the same dynamic across different relationships, different decades, different disguises. It isn't bad luck. It isn't a flaw in their judgment about people. It's that the golden shadow, left unclaimed, broadcasts itself to exactly the kind of psyche built to locate and extract it. The way an unlocked door doesn't cause a burglary, but it does make one statistically more likely, regardless of how many times the homeowner insists they're simply too trusting. The transformation, then, isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone who admires you. It's about becoming the conscious owner of what's being admired. Sarah, 8 months after the relationship with her Daniel finally ended, not because she found the courage all at once, but because she finally noticed the pattern clearly enough to stop excusing it, described the shift in a way that captured Jung's entire theory in a single image. She said it felt like she had spent years handing people a lit candle without realizing her hand was the only thing keeping it from blowing out, and that the moment she finally noticed her own hand, she also noticed she got to decide who was allowed to stand close enough to feel its warmth, because the light was never the danger. The danger was forgetting it was yours to direct. There's a final piece of this framework Jung returned to often in his later writing, one that reframes the entire ordeal in a way most people don't expect from a psychologist who spent decades cataloging human suffering. He didn't see these painful entanglements as simply damage to be repaired and forgotten. He saw them, when survived and understood, as one of the most direct paths toward individuation available to a person, a forced confrontation with exactly the unclaimed material the psyche most needed to integrate. The relationship that nearly destroyed you wasn't, in his framework, a meaningless cruelty inflicted by a broken person who happened to cross your path. It was, however, unwillingly an extraordinarily efficient teacher, showing you with brutal clarity the exact location of the gold you'd spent your whole life giving away for free. This is not the same as saying it was deserved, or that you should be grateful to the person who exploited you. Jung was careful about that distinction, and so should you be. The narcissist's responsibility for their own harm doesn't dissolve because the encounter ultimately taught you something. But the encounter can still teach you something, and refusing the lesson out of understandable anger toward the teacher is its own kind of self-sabotage, because the alternative to learning it is repeating it, with a different name attached to the same psychological role, indefinitely. What Jung ultimately concluded, after decades of watching this exact pattern play out across countless lives in his consulting room, was this: the people who are targeted longest and hardest by narcissists are rarely the weak. They are the unclaimed strong, people carrying enormous reserves of light, depth, and capability that they have never fully recognized as their own, and therefore have never fully learned to protect. What that means for your life today is simpler and harder than it sounds. It means the work in front of you isn't to become less generous, less perceptive, less emotionally capable, in some misguided effort to stop attracting this dynamic. It means the work is to finally, consciously, take ownership of the very qualities that made you a target in the first place. Not to hide them, but to direct them deliberately toward people who have actually earned access to them, rather than people who simply located them first. So here's the question worth sitting with, long after this video ends. If your strength has spent years operating in the dark, unclaimed, available to whoever found it first, what might change in your life, starting today, the moment you finally turn the light toward yourself and see, for the first time, exactly how much of it you've been carrying all along?